Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
All right, so let's dive into something I think we can all relate to. Risk.
Yeah.
Like those decisions where you're kind of weighing, like, am I playing it safe or am I about to jump off a cliff?
Right, yeah.
Well, that's risk preference in action.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a lot more complicated than it seems.
It really is.
Like, think about when you're trying to decide between, like, a safe investment and then one that has, potential for huge gains, but also big losses.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That's what we're talking about today.
We're navigating risk constantly.
Right. And we're using this really cool study. Mm-hmm. It was published in Nature Human Behavior.
Okay.
Back in 2025.
Yeah.
And it's huge. I mean, the team, Bagaïni and their team,
Yeah.
analyzed data from 33 different projects.
Wow.
With over 500,000 participants.
That's a lot of data.
It is. It's a lot.
Yeah.
And they were really trying to answer this question of, is risk preference like a stable part of who we are, like our personality? Or does it change based on, what's going on around us?
That's a big question.
It is.
Yeah.
The big one. And, right off the bat, they ran into a problem, which was, how do you even measure risk preference?
That's a good point.
Turns out there's no one agreed upon way to measure it. And that makes it tricky to answer that question of, is it stable or is it changing?
So how did they even approach this if there's no standard way to measure it?
Well, they looked at how researchers have been trying to measure risk preference.
Okay.
And they found there's three main categories.
All right.
So we've got propensity, frequency, and behavioral measures.
Okay, break those down for me. Like, what is each one actually measuring?
So propensity is like your attitude towards risk.
Okay.
It's like, imagine asking someone like how much they'd enjoy walking a tightrope.
Okay.
It's about their feelings,
Yeah.
about the risk, not their actions.
Gotcha.
But frequency, on the other hand, is looking at how often you actually engage in risky activities.
Oh.
So how often are you actually walking that tightrope in real life?
So propensity is how you feel about risk, and frequency is how often you actually take risks.
Yeah.
What about that third one, behavioral?
So behavioral measures are a little different.
Okay.
They kind of put you in a controlled setting and they see what you do.
Right.
So imagine a researcher says, here's $100.
Okay.
You can keep it, or you can gamble it on a coin toss and potentially double it.
Interesting.
And then they watch what you choose.
So you're actually watching someone behave in a risky situation.
Right.
Instead of just asking them about it.
Exactly.
But if they used all three of these, why is it such a problem that there's no standard way to measure it?
Because they found that these different measures don't always agree with each other.
Oh, really?
Which makes you wonder, are we even measuring the same thing with these different approaches?
So somebody might say they're a big risk taker, but then freeze up when they actually have to, make a risky decision.
Right, exactly.
It seems like a pretty big disconnect. It suggests there's more to risk preference than meets the eye.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're going to unpack today.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So we've got these three different ways to measure risk preference, but they don't always agree.
Right.
So what did the study find when they looked at how these measurements change over time? Like, was there any consistency?
Well, think about it this way. If risk preference is really a stable part of who we are, then the way we measure it should be pretty consistent over time.
Okay, yeah.
Like, if you're an outgoing person today,
Yeah.
you'll probably still be pretty outgoing in a few years.
Right.
So was it like that for risk?
Yeah, so did they find that our taste for risk is steady? Or are we like risk butterflies?
Oh, okay.
Like flitting from one daring choice to playing it safe the next?
It was kind of a mixed bag.
Really?
Yeah, so propensity and frequency measures, those were more stable over time, similar to how personality traits are consistent.
Interesting.
So, if you say you generally enjoy taking risks, or if you report doing risky things pretty often,
Okay.
chances are you'll answer similarly a few years later.
Okay, but you mentioned before those on-the-spot decisions,
Yeah,
the behavioral measures, those were less consistent.
exactly.
Okay.
So our general feelings about risk and how often we say we take risks might be stable,
Uh-huh.
but our actual choices when we're in a risky situation, those are more fluid. Seem to be more influenced by, the context of the situation.
It's like saying you're a total thrill seeker,
Yeah.
but then you choose the kiddie coaster instead of the one that, seems to defy gravity.
Right.
It's all about the situation.
It is.
But how do they even, track these changes over time? Did they like follow people around for years watching them make risky choices?
That would be an interesting study.
Yeah.
But no,
Okay.
they used a statistical model. It's called the MASC model.
Right.
And basically, it analyzes how things change or stay the same over time.
So like a statistical time machine.
Kind of, yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
The MASC model. So what did it tell us about how risk-taking changes over a lifetime?
Well, one thing they found was that age actually plays a role.
Okay.
So for some measures, stability peaked in middle age,
Really?
which seems kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you think younger people would be the big risk takers.
You'd think so, yeah.
Oh,
But maybe it's that younger people are just better at bouncing back from bad decisions.
that's true.
Yeah.
Peak risk-taking in your 40s.
Yeah,
That's a fascinating thought.
it is.
But, I mean, it raises a big question. If these different ways of measuring risk aren't that stable, and they're not really consistent over time, are they really measuring the same thing? You've hit on a crucial point.
Okay.
So the study also looked at what's called convergent validity,
Okay.
which is basically how much different measures agree with each other.
Right.
And what they found is that agreement was pretty low, which again suggests those measures might not be capturing the same underlying thing.
So it's like assuming all fruit is sweet just because you tried a strawberry.
Exactly. You gotta try more than one kind of fruit to know if sweetness is really a universal characteristic.
Right.
Same with risk preference.
Okay.
Just because one measure says you're a risk taker, that doesn't mean other measures will agree.
Give me a real world example. Like, what does this low agreement actually look like?
Okay, so imagine you're trying to figure out someone's financial risk tolerance.
Okay.
You could use a propensity measure and ask them how comfortable they are investing in the stock market.
All right.
But you could also use a behavioral measure and give them some actual money to invest, let them choose between different options.
Gotcha.
Someone might say they're a really risky investor.
Yeah.
But then choose the safest option when it's their actual money.
So even if they say they're a risk taker, their actions might not match up.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
And the study found that while those attitude measures, those propensity measures,
Yeah.
they agreed with each other pretty well.
Yeah.
They didn't agree as much with the frequency and behavioral measures.
So what does this all mean? Are we just doomed to like misunderstand risk preference forever? Like, is it even possible to get a clear picture?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
And we'll dive into that in the next part.
All right, listeners, buckle up.
Yeah,
This deep dive is about to get even more fascinating.
it is.
So we've kind of established here that measuring risk preference is a lot trickier than it seems.
It is.
You know, these different measures don't always agree.
Right?
They're not even that consistent over time.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily about throwing out all these different measures.
Okay.
Instead, the authors of the study, they suggest that we need to think more critically about how we're measuring risk.
Okay.
And what those measurements are actually telling us.
Gotcha.
Like, it's kind of like using a map, right? Right.
It's a useful tool,
Yeah.
but you got to know how to read it correctly
Right.
and understand its limitations.
So how do we start reading this risk map more effectively?
Yeah.
What are the practical implications of all this? It can't just be an academic exercise, right?
Oh, absolutely not.
Okay.
Understanding risk preference has real-world implications
Okay.
for all kinds of decisions, big and small. I mean, think about it. Financial advisors,
Yeah.
they use risk profiles to help their clients make investment decisions.
Right.
Doctors might consider a patient's risk tolerance when they're discussing treatment options.
Uh-huh.
Policymakers need to understand public risk perception to create, effective campaigns.
So it's not just about abstract theory. It's
Right.
about understanding how people make decisions.
Yeah, in all areas of life.
Okay.
And these findings suggest we need to be more nuanced in how we approach risk.
Okay.
It's not enough to just slap a label on someone and say, oh, they're a risk taker.
Or they're risk averse.
Yeah.
We need to dig a little deeper and consider the context.
So instead of just saying, I always play it safe,
Yeah.
I need to pay attention to this specific situation.
Right.
And what's influencing my choice in that moment.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that's where this research becomes really powerful.
Yeah.
It challenges us to move beyond these simple labels
Uh-huh.
and explore how complex human decision-making really is.
That's fascinating.
It is.
But if these measures aren't that reliable on their own,
Yeah.
how can we even begin to study risk preference effectively?
Right.
It seems like we're stuck in a paradox.
It is a challenge, but it's not insurmountable.
Okay.
The study authors suggest we need to focus more on understanding the factors that influence our choices
Okay.
in different situations.
But what kinds of factors?
Well, like what aspects of a situation make us more or less likely to take a risk?
Okay.
What role do our emotions play?
Interesting.
What about past experiences? Even the people around us can influence our choices.
So instead of looking for that one perfect measure of risk,
Yeah,
we need to start looking at the bigger picture.
exactly.
It's less about, am I a risk taker? And more about what makes me more or less likely to take a risk in this specific moment.
Exactly. It's a shift in perspective that could lead to a much deeper understanding of how we make decisions under uncertainty.
That's a really interesting takeaway.
Yeah.
So instead of like feeling discouraged by the fact that risk preference is so hard to pin down,
Right.
we can use this knowledge to be more mindful about how we make choices
Absolutely.
in different contexts.
Yeah, it's like being given a new lens through which to view our own decision-making process.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we're not just passive passengers
Right.
on the risk roller coaster.
Yeah, we have the power to understand
Uh-huh.
and even influence our own choices.
I'm curious, what would that look like in practice? Like, how can we become more active participants in our own risk-taking?
Well, one practical step is to start paying attention to those moments.
Okay.
When you feel pulled towards or away from a risky choice,
Right.
ask yourself, what's going on in that moment? What factors are influencing my decision?
Okay.
Am I feeling pressured by other people? Am I excited by the potential rewards?
Right.
Anxious about the potential losses?
So it's about being more self-aware
Yeah,
and recognizing those internal and external forces that are shaping our choices.
exactly.
And that seems like a valuable skill in any situation,
It is.
not just when we're making like big life-altering decisions.
Absolutely. And the more we practice this kind of self-reflection, the more we can start to understand our own unique risk fingerprint.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
A risk fingerprint.
We can start to see the patterns in our own behavior.
Okay.
And recognize the situations where we're more or less likely to take a risk.
So instead of trying to fit ourselves into these neat little boxes
Right.
of risk taker or risk averse, we can use this knowledge to become more intentional
Right.
and informed decision makers.
Exactly. It's about empowering ourselves to make choices that are aligned with our values and goals,
Yeah.
even when we're facing uncertainty.
All right, listeners,
Yeah.
we've explored the challenges of measuring risk preference
Right.
and those surprising ways that it shifts and changes over time.
Uh-huh.
But we've also, I think, uncovered some powerful takeaways
Yeah.
about how to become more aware of our own risk-taking tendencies.
Absolutely.
But before we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
we need to answer the big question.
Yeah.
What does this all mean for you? Like, how can understanding these different measures and their limitations actually help you make better decisions?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's one that we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've been talking about how risk preference, well, it's not as straightforward as it seems.
Right. It really is.
It's kind of like trying to predict the weather.
Uh-huh.
You can, look for patterns and stuff.
Yeah.
But there's always a chance for like a surprise storm.
Exactly.
And that unpredictability,
Uh-huh.
that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating.
It is.
It really challenges like our assumptions about how consistent we are
Yeah.
when it comes to our risk-taking behavior.
It really does make you wonder.
It does.
Like, if all these different ways of measuring risk are all over the place,
Yeah.
what does that even mean
Right.
for understanding my own risk preferences?
Should I just like throw my hands up and just go with my gut every time?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it actually highlights one of the most important takeaways from this research.
Okay, what's that?
So, while it might seem like we're kind of at the mercy of these, ever-changing risk preferences, this study actually suggests we might have more control than we think.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
I thought the whole point was that risk preference is like super hard to measure.
Right.
And it changes a lot.
Yeah.
How does that give us more control?
Well, because if our risk preferences are so dependent on the context,
Uh-huh.
then understanding the things that influence our choices
Yeah.
in different situations
Okay.
becomes even more crucial.
So instead of just saying I'm a risk taker
Right.
or I'm risk averse,
Right.
I need to pay closer attention to the specific situation.
Yeah.
And like what's driving my decision in that moment.
Precisely.
Okay.
And the study authors, they actually emphasize the need for more research that explores those contextual factors in detail.
Like what kind of factors are they talking about?
Well, things like what aspects of a situation make us more or less likely to take a risk?
Okay.
What role do our emotions play? What about past experiences?
Yeah.
Even, the people around us can influence our choices.
So it's not about giving up on like understanding risk preference.
Right.
It's about getting more, sophisticated in how we approach it.
Exactly. It's an invitation to move beyond those like simple labels and really delve into the complexity of human decision making.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive,
Okay.
what's like the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with? What's that thought-provoking question they should be pondering as they go about their day?
Here's something to consider. If we accept that our risk preferences are kind of fluid
Okay.
and that they're influenced by context, does that mean we actually have more agency in shaping our own risk-taking behavior than we realize?
That's a really good question.
I encourage you, listener, to think about situations where you might exhibit different risk preferences.
Okay.
Are you like bolder when it comes to your career choices, but then play it safe with your financial investments? Or maybe you're a thrill seeker in like social situations, but more cautious about your health.
Yeah.
Reflect on those differences and what they might reveal about the factors that are shaping your own unique approach to risk.
It's a really good point.
Yeah.
It's like a reminder that we're not just passengers on this risk roller coaster.
Right.
We have the power to understand and even influence our own choices.
And by understanding the forces at play, we can become more informed navigators of the risks and rewards that life throws our way.
Absolutely. And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.